Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about presenting instruction. In the last module we talked about how to do your lesson planning with regards to kind of taking your students' needs into account when you're actually planning your instruction. That way that sets your students up for success, you know where to meet them on the learning curve, you know where to start your instruction, and therefore they don't get frustrated, you set them up for success, and it reduces a lot of those challenging behaviors. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to take everything that you guys plan for in your lesson planning and how to actually present that. So our objectives are here on the left. For our agenda, we're going to be talking about the rationale for direct and explicit instruction. Then we're going to talk briefly about relationships. And then the main part of the video will be on the components of effective instruction, which are 5 of them. And I would say this video in this module kind of takes what we did talk about in Module 7 and kind of puts it into perspective with regards to how do you actually go and present it. So you guys will see a lot of overlap from Module 7 into this video. So what's the rationale for having instruction be direct and explicit? And I can say just this video in general, it kind of gives you guys just a lot of times we're discussing things from the book in this video, and I'll try to expand on it as much as I can, but the book does a really good job with this module and this chapter. So there might be parts in this video where I'll just kind of tell you guys to read the book, but this is one of them. I would read this section in the book on what's the rationale for having instruction be direct and explicit. Basically, it's because that's evidence-based. The research has showed it's an evidence-based practice. The research has shown that providing direct and explicit instruction provides you gives your students the best probability that they're going to be successful. So it provides the best probability of success. And your book talks about 2 different kind of projects that give support to that. And also there's just a lot of research in the literature showing that the best way to set your students up for success is to provide that direct and explicit instruction. And we have mentioned this at the very beginning of the course as well. I also wanted to talk about a system called CHAMPS that you guys can basically use with all of your rules, all of your procedures, all of your activities in the class, and things like that. If you don't use CHAMPS in your school district or your school or your classroom, then it is something really cool to look into. It tells your students what your expectations are for, like I said, each of your activities or your rules or whatever it is that you need expectations for. And so basically, if you look at these 2 examples of it, this is using CHAMPS for independent work. And so usually the C stands for the conversation level. So how loud should they be talking? So you guys can see, this is independent work, this is centers. So with independent work, you're very quiet, it's a whisper. And the conversation level for the centers is that level 2. So you can have conversations with your peers. The H typically stands for help. So what do the students need to do before they ask for help? So ask 3 before me and then raise your hand. The A typically stands for activity. So what tasks are they supposed to be doing? So for independent work, they're working at your seat. For the centers, they're working on the centers. The M typically stands for movement. So what level of movement should they have? P typically stands for participation. So how will the teacher know that they're participating? And the teacher will know that they're participating in their independent work if they've completed their assigned work. And in the centers, it's completed the center expectations. And then S equals success. So if they've done all of these, they should be successful at their independent work or successful at the centers. So it just provides that really direct, explicit instruction. It tells the students exactly what you expect from them for your activities or centers or anything like that. All right, I did want to talk about just kind of briefly, making sure that you guys are really cognizant about the relationship between you and the students, making sure that's really positive and things like that. So here, because this matters, and we talked about this once again at the beginning of the course, but the more that you genuinely care about your students and you develop those really positive relationships, the more that they will listen to you, the more that they'll be engaged in what you're saying, and the more likely they are to learn from you, and the less likely you are to have challenging behaviors. And that's especially true with our kids with EBD. A lot of times they don't have those really good positive relationships with their teachers, and therefore they don't want to listen to them. They get frustrated, they engage in challenging behavior, and they typically get sent to the office and they get out of the teacher's classroom. And, great for the teacher. The teacher doesn't have to deal with those challenging behaviors. The student doesn't have to be in a classroom where the teacher doesn't like them. But all in all, it's really bad for the learner because our kids with EBD are lower academically, they're lower with their social skills and things like that. So if you just don't have that positive relationship with them, you just send them out of your class, then yeah, that solves the problem for both of you guys for that moment. But it doesn't solve it in the long run. It actually makes it way worse. So I want to challenge you guys with your kids with EBD, get in there, develop those relationships. The more they have that positive relationship with the teacher, the more they are engaged, and the less likely it is for them to engage in those challenging behaviors. And if that can happen, then they can actually start to catch up academically and learn those skills, and they will be more successful in the future. And a lot of times the teachers that take the time and really try and develop their relationships with those kids with EBD, those kids actually become their favorite students. So it's actually kind of cool. So here's some things that you guys can do to develop those relationships. Be enthusiastic about your subject matter. Be excited about what you're teaching. If you get up there and you hate what you're teaching and it's boring, then your students are going to think it's boring too, and they're not going to want to listen. So just liking what you're doing and liking your subject matter, and also taking the time to connect it to their students' lives. I know I've provided some examples in the past, especially with my college kids, that were really outdated. So I thought they were relevant, but then when I look back, they were really kind of outdated in their lives. So just keeping up with their lives and the current trends and what's going on, and just making sure that you connect it to, like I said, their life. That's important. Providing encouragement, so indicating that you believe in them. Ask leading questions designed to promote success. So maybe ask questions that you know that they know, so that way you can encourage them and they can get some of that positive feedback. And then, you might ask ones that are a little challenging if you want, but then make sure that you have enough in there that you know that they'll be successful with. And then here are just some other things. Options and choices are huge. That's a big antecedent strategy for decreasing challenging behavior. Giving students a choice of, if they come down to the floor to do circle time or story time or something like that, maybe giving them a choice as to where they sit. Do they want to sit here or there? And realize that you want your choices to be equal so it doesn't affect instruction. So you don't want to give them the choice of, do you want to play or do math? Because they're probably going to want to play, and they're not going to get their math done. But you want to do something like, do you want to work on math first, or do you want to work on reading first? And that way they're getting both of them. They just get to choose which one they want to do. So wherever you can put choices in, it's just really, really important. And I always have to work on my choices. So I would plan out your choices beforehand, especially with your kids with EBD. I just noticed, my daughter's too, so I'm trying to give her choices a lot. And I'll say stuff like, do you want to get dressed? And of course she'll say no. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do now? I gave her the choice and she said no. So I wouldn't pose that type of question to your students, and I'm working on that as a parent, not to give those types of questions because the answer is always no. So you don't want to say something like, do you want to work now? Because then they're likely to say no. And you want to honor that because you gave them a choice. So work on what you give as choices and making sure that whichever one they pick is actually okay and you don't go back on letting them choose. Make sure you deliver praise in a genuine manner. So we talked about that genuine smile and things like that. So they know, they can detect whether you're being genuine or not. We know when people are being fake and when they're being real, and students do too. They're pretty perceptive in that aspect. And then if you are delivering a correction, make sure that you just deliver it in a neutral manner. So you don't want to act like you're like really frustrated or you're angry with the student or anything like that. Think of it from the perspective of, an error is kind of a way to provide more engaging instruction. And if they get it right, then you can give that enthusiasm and encouragement. So really think about your kind of emotions being really positive and enthusiastic or very neutral. You really don't want to ever let the students know that you're getting frustrated with them or anything like that. Just be very neutral. And then when they get something right or engage in the correct behavior, then you're really excited and you're enthusiastic and you're encouraging, and that builds those positive relationships. Okay, so next I wanted to talk about the essential components of effective instruction. And basically, I'm just going to kind of be pointing out some key points that your book talks about. And I do have a lot of words in these slides, so you guys might want to pause them, or a lot of these tables come from your book, so you can also look in your book as well. But okay, so basically this is just a big overview and summary of what's in your book, so please go back and read through it in your book. But whenever you're whenever you're providing that effective instruction, these are the 5 essential components that you need to make sure that you do. First, so I'm just going to kind of go through each of these. First, you want to introduce the lesson. So tell the students what the lesson is, how much, why you're doing it, connect it to the past and the future. So some things to be aware of, introduce it in a way that interests and engages the students. Tell stories, connect it to the past and the future, like is on this table. Once again, that's on the table. Make sure you tell students what they're going to be doing, why they're doing it, and you communicate your expectations and you're really clear. This is where that chance thing comes into play as well. And think about what you talked about in Module 7, those key rules and those anchor rules. So this is where you're going to explain that key rule or that anchor. You're going to explain your rule and you're going to connect it to, like I said, something in the past. So those key rules, anchor rules that they've already been taught, make it meaningful and connect it. With regards to engaging the student, you can tell stories. Those are really engaging the students typically, so keep that in mind. Next part, you're going to model, demonstrate, and explain key lesson components. So with the second part, so modeling and demonstrating, these are some things that go off of that. So these are the keys to effective modeling during instruction. So first of all, you want to start providing your examples and making sure that they're authentic. So find examples that are relevant to the students, that the students have experienced, and things like that. Also, you can tell stories here about the skills too that will interest and engage the students. These are things that we kind of mentioned also in Module 7. This is definitely Module 7. So sequence examples to call attention to the range of possibilities and the limits. So don't forget about picking out your instructional universe and picking those examples and making sure that you're sequencing them in a way that you have what we say some positive examples, and the positive examples differ in the relevant features, and then you have a negative example that just changes very slightly from the last positive example. So typically, whatever your last positive example is, you're going to do the same thing for that negative, but the behavior is going to be different. The behavior is going to be, the positive example is going to be what the student should do, And the negative example is going to be the same situation as that last positive one, but it's going to be what the student should not do. And then you make sure you do another positive example, so you end on a positive example for the students. But making sure that, you have sequenced those examples appropriately is hugely important here. Next, when you model, you want to make sure that you model with verbal explanations. So every time you're doing a skill or you're doing a step, you want to verbally go through that in a step-by-step manner as much as possible. So explain every detail, everything that you're doing, call attention to each step, why you're doing it that way, why it's in that order, and things like that. Oh, sorry. And then, so sorry, I have some examples for you guys. These are also in your book, so you guys can, I'm just going to talk about the first one, but you guys can either pause this video or go in your book and look at this table. But, so if the skill is raise your hand and wait for teacher acknowledgement before speaking, you should do this during group lessons and discussions. So this is kind of an example of what the teacher would do when she's modeling. So her verbal behavior when she's modeling. So she'll say something like, let me show you how to raise your hand when we're having a group lesson or discussion. So I'm sitting here like you would be, and so she's actually sitting down, and I'm noticing that the teacher is in front of the room and all the other students are listening. The teacher asked a question, and I totally know the answer, and I really want to say it out loud, but I don't say it. Instead, I put my hand up, and so she'll put her hand up then and say, notice how I put it up really high and straight so that the teacher will see it more easily. I might not get called on this time, but what would happen if I just yelled out the answer? So she's basically, sitting down, looking around, putting her hand up, and as she's doing that, she's verbally explaining every detail and why she's doing it and what's going on in the classroom and things like that. So these are just two other examples that you guys can read through and set on your own. And steps 4 and 5, I kind of think of them as kind of combined together, so that's why I have them in one block. But you want to make sure that you engage the students in the lesson. So, have some open-ended questions. Why do you think I do it like this? Have students do some of the modeling as part of instruction. So you want students to also practice, and that way you can provide feedback and things like that. And then increase questions related to the content while you're modeling. So, at the beginning, you'll start with those open-ended questions and start engaging the students. And then towards your later examples, you want to start giving what we call opportunities to respond. So, ask the students questions, have them make verbal responses. You might do response cards. You might have some choral responding. You might ask them to raise their hands, things like that. There's a bunch of different ways to do opportunities to respond that can really engage the students and get them active in it. And then you want to go to, like I said, more specific questions. So, what should I do next? What do I do? And, think about the sequencing of your examples as well. When you start with the first example, that's when you want those open-ended questions. You're just introducing the lesson, or you've already introduced it, now you're starting to show examples. And so then once you've shown example after example, and you're using your opportunities to respond, at the very end, they've had a couple examples, so you should be able to ask those more specific questions, like, what should I do next? And they should be able to tell you. So that's kind of the sequence: open-ended, opportunities to respond, and then your last example, or your last couple examples, asking them more specific questions. What should I do next? And things like that. All right, here's just some examples of opportunities to respond. A verbal response, which can be just answering the question. It can be choral responding. I know our kids with, whenever I'm in the clinical setting, we use what we call language for learning, and it's this program that requires individual responding as well as choral responding, so they all respond as a group, and things like that. And so that would just be, if you guys are looking for kind of a choral responding program, language for learning is great. They can engage in action, so you can tell them to put their finger on the picture of the test tube on page 49,
Stand up if you agree with Susan. If you agree, give a thumbs up. If you don't agree, thumbs down. You can do response cards. So green card if you think this is right, red if you don't.
Hold up your A, B, or C card. You can do, whiteboards, things like that. Sorry, that would be demonstration. My bad. Then demonstration. Everybody write down their paper. Everyone works a problem on their whiteboard and holds it up. You can have people come up to the class. Billy, show us how you did yours. Things like that. So there's a couple of different modalities. So it's verbal responses, action response card, and demonstration. And then lots of different examples within those types of modalities. And I want to just make a comment. Opportunities to respond are really important because Skinner, remember, this class is based off of ABA, so we focus a lot on Skinner's work. And Skinner talks about being a listener and a speaker. And Skinner talks about how you have to have both of those repertoires, to actually really understand and comprehend what the teacher is talking about. So if you are just sitting there as an instructor, just talking, that's only half of the work that you should be doing. So the students will listen, but they're not going to fully comprehend and understand what you're talking about unless they can talk about it, unless they can speak.
So they have to be both listeners and speakers. And so giving them a chance to respond provides that speaker component, whether it be through action or response card or demonstration or that verbal response. And then you get more of the speaker when you actually put them in groups and they do some more hands-on activities and they talk to their friends about it and things like that. But when you're just teaching, these opportunities to respond, give them that speaker component and make your whole lesson more it allows them to fully
comprehend it more than them just sitting there and listening. It makes them more engaged and everything like that. Okay, I wanted to point out that your opportunities to respond are controlled by you, and they're a way to maintain and assess student engagement. So, we've kind of talked, there are different, if you notice that your kids are getting bored, you can use opportunities to respond to engage them. If you want to make sure that they are actually listening to what you're saying and they maintain it, you can use them to assess whatever they're learning. So keep that in mind. And you can use, here's some guidelines to kind of selecting and implementing opportunities to respond. We talked about at the beginning of the lesson, you'll use those kind of open-ended questions. Has this ever happened to you? Have you heard of anything like this? Things like that. You want to make sure that you vary the type and the delivery of opportunities to respond while modeling. So you might have, with those verbal responses, you might ask a couple students for a verbal response, then you might have some choral responding, then you might have them demonstrate it, and things like that. You might have them then hold up a response card. So make sure that those opportunities to respond kind of vary. You can use it to manage the lesson. So making sure everybody's staying on task. Raise your red card if you're on the floor. Everybody show me your finger on page 25, things like that. And then you can use them to assess understanding. So raise your hand if you think this is the right way. Why is this not right? And then the students do make errors. You can also use them as a form of correction. So, you ask a student, they give an answer, and you could say something like, what would be a better way to do this? Or show me the first step again. Now, do you think A or B makes sense? And so if they're making, errors either individually or as a group, you can use your opportunities to respond as a way to do the form of correction. So a bunch of different ways to use opportunities to respond.
Manage your lesson, making sure that the students understand what you're talking about, making sure that the students are engaged, using them as a form of correction, things like that. And then you also want to monitor your opportunities to respond. And I'm actually going to talk about this a little bit more in Module 9 as well. So I wanted to kind of introduce it here and then also talk about it in Module 9. But, with ABA, we always like behaviors that we can see. That way we can measure and we can monitor and we can make sure that they're being effective, or our procedures are being effective. So we want to make sure that everything that we're doing when we're presenting instruction is evidence-based. It has research behind it. And we always want to make sure that we use those behaviors that are observable, measurable, so that we can measure them, so that we can make sure that they're effective and that we're implementing them in the right way. So monitoring and measuring your opportunities to respond is really important. So I would really urge you guys to start doing this if you can. So start using your opportunities to respond and start actually monitoring them. It'll make them more effective, which makes the lesson easier for your students to understand, and you'll have more learning taking place. So you can look at some benchmarks with regards to your opportunities to respond. So if you have, and then you can look at them in like a dark, a medium, and a light kind of category. And if they're in a dark category after you measure them, then you need to stop and do something different. If they're in a medium, then just kind of caution it. They might recommend intervention. And if you're in the light area, keep going. You're doing a great job. So basically, you want to measure time on task, or you want to measure the academic engagement. And if your students are engaged less than 80% of the time, then you need to do something different. If they're engaged 81 to 90% of the time, then just be aware of it. And 91 to 100% of the time, great. Keep doing what you're doing. You're doing awesome. And so here are just some things that you guys can do. There are forums online that you guys can look at. There's an academic engagement monitoring forum. We've talked about ways to data collection systems. You guys can use your momentary time sampling. You can use your, that's probably what I would typically do, especially when you're teaching. But you can do 5-minute recording time, use during your teacher guided instruction, use for class-wise monitoring, and things like that. So yeah, just kind of have some ways to measure academic engagement, use an interval system, things like that, and just make sure that your students are engaged. Looking at your opportunities to respond per 10-minute interval. So 10-minute recording time, and then you want to look at how many opportunities to respond you give. And here's a data sheet that you guys can use as well. This is Form 5.5. And basically, every time you do an opportunity to respond, you either put an I or a C. So an I would be you're doing an opportunity to respond for an individual student. A C is for the whole class. And so after this 10-minute period, you can go and you can count. So for a 10-minute period, if you have fewer than 10, you need to do something different. If you have 10 to 40, you're okay. More than 40, you're great. Keep doing that. So you can see in a 10-minute period, you should have more than 40 opportunities to respond. So these are things that you're going to use a lot during your lesson. You want to look at your ratio of interactions, positive to negative. And this is the part that I'll be talking about more in Module 9. So if you have less than 1-to-1 or less than 1 interaction per minute, then you need to do something different. At least 1-to-1 consistently, you're okay, and at least 3-to-1 consistently. So 3 positive to 1 negative interaction consistently. That's awesome. And this is done in a 20-minute recording time. Any activity, and the form is 5.6 if you guys want to kind of look these up. And I would say that this is for just kind of a normal, everyday, general education kid. Our kids with EBD actually need a lot more than this. I think it's about 9-to-1, so they need a significantly more number of positive interactions to 1 negative. So that's where those, the positive relation comes into play. And then you also want to look at disruptions. So there's a misbehavior monitoring form. Use one for duration of one activity or entire period. If you have more than 10 disruptions, something different. You need
you need to change something up. 5 to 10, something to be aware of, and fewer than 5, then you're doing awesome. So these are just kind of, they call them the 5 basic behavior benchmarks. And like I said, you guys can kind of go Google them. There's forms for each of these, and you guys can look at that. And then I do actually have a form, the form 5.2. So this is just a basic observation form, and it kind of talks about a couple of these different things and just how to do them. And like I said, I'll circle back on this on Module 9, but I just wanted to introduce this to you guys. So you can see journal observation period for 10 minutes. This is recording the ratio of interactions, which is right here. So you can look at, this is your positive, this is your negative. So total after 10 minutes, you got 7 positive to 2 negative. And so you are hitting that. If this would be kind of a typical gen ed kid, you're hitting that 3 to 1. If this is a kid with EBD, you need a lot more positive. You can do your opportunities to respond, and they just tallied them, but you could do an I and a C like we talked about on the previous form. She had 22, so if we look at our opportunities to respond, she's right here. She could do more, so yeah, you probably would. It says caution, intervention recommended. She probably wants to increase that a little bit. And then disruptions, she only had 1. So she's doing really great right here. And then this actually looks at time on task. So this is every 5 minutes. And so I would say, like I said, I would probably do momentary time sampling. So after 5 minutes, you can see if... So every 5 minutes she focused on one student, every 5 minutes she focused on a different student, and so I would probably say at the end of this she probably looked at one student, saw if they were engaged or not, if they were a plus, if not a minus, and she got time on task 93%. So basically you're going to go through, there's 60 marks, you're going to do how many pluses you have divided by 60 times 100, and that gives you your percentage. So she has 93, which is right up here, and she's doing great on time on task. Okay, so talked about introducing the lesson, talked about modeling, making sure that you get your instructional universe, you pick out those sequences, that you're modeling everything, and when you're modeling them, you're talking through it, and you're doing your opportunities to respond, and things like that. Next, you want to guide your student practice. So you want your students to actually practice this. Rehearsal is a huge aspect with regards to effective instruction. So when you pick examples for them to practice, pick examples that give them high rates of success. So they're really easy at first. Remember, you want to set them up for success. So give them something really easy, and then you can make the examples and make them practice harder, the examples harder and things like that. And also, I mentioned this previously in the course, but you want small repetitions of practice each day rather than a big math section all at once. And we know this is what I mentioned earlier, even with studying, you guys are way better, you'll do way better on your college courses and your exams if you study a little bit each day as opposed to not looking at the material and studying for 5 or 6 hours or studying all night the night before. You're retaining it better if you do those small repetitions of math practice. And whenever your students are practicing, you want to make sure that you're prompting and you're providing feedback and things like that. So you are actively involved in their student practice. You're guiding it. That's why we have the word guide here. So just a couple things. These were in here, but just to summarize this, practice is guided by teacher with prompting as necessary. Use your examples wisely, so really easy ones at first, high rates of success. Practice occurs in those small repetitions each day, and then the prompting and feedback is continuous. And then you want to facilitate authentic and independent practice. So, teach expectations to the role, provide prompts ahead of time, fade your teacher attention and prompting. That's really important. And maintain the feedback, but fade the frequency. So whenever they do actually independent practice, that's when you want to do your, teacher exceptions to the rule, provide your prompts. Lots of prompting at the beginning because they're moving into kind of a new condition where they're doing it on their own. So lots of prompting, but then you want to pay that prompting back. So teacher prompts ahead of independent practice. So remind them of all the rules and things like that before they go into the independent practice. Once again, make sure it occurs in small repetitions each day. And fade out that attention and prompting because you want them to engage in behavior independently without your prompts. So lots of prompting at the beginning to set them up for success, to make the probability of them engaging the correct response more likely, but then fade out that prompt. And then once again, feedback gradually becomes less frequent. And then I wanted to remind you guys of your classroom arrangement. So, whenever you're guiding student practice and then you're facilitating independent practice, think about the physical environment of the classroom, your movement, how are you going to move around, make sure that, you're in close proximity to your kids that have EBD or really need you. So all those things that we talked about in previous modules, they come into play when you're actually teaching the lesson and presenting it, making sure that they have the perception that you can look at them and be with them within 1 second. So that's where that classroom environment facilitates this. And then last but not least, you always want to assess your students. So sometimes assessments get kind of a bad rap, especially in education and things like that, but they are really important. You really do need to assess your students to just make sure that they have maintained the skills and that they've learned something, essentially. And I found this master learning cycle that I actually really like. And you guys can look through it. You can use it if you want. You don't have to use it. But here's a new unit, and it kind of talks about testing your prerequisite skills. These are also important because this tells you where your learners are in that learning curve or what skills you need to break down to smaller components and do your task analysis and things like that. And if you don't have prereqs, then you might need to do some corrective teaching. And you want to look at, if everybody is above 80%. If they're not, are some individuals above 80%? If some individuals are not, then you need to do corrective teaching and things like that. If everybody's above 80%, then proceed with the unit. And so you guys can read this and kind of go through it. But I think it's kind of I like visuals and I like flowcharts. So I kind of like this mastery of learning. But, you do need to assess them somehow, whether it be, quizzes, exams, and think about your UDL, so Universal Design of Learning. You might want to have some different ways to test them, because remember, students can have barriers, especially your kids with EBD and your other kids that might have disabilities and things like that. So maybe they do a presentation about a topic, or maybe they write a song or things like that. So you can assess them in different ways than just, quizzes and exams and things like that. So keep that in mind. And then just making sure that, if they're not successful on their assessment, that you go back, you reteach, and you move to the next skill when they've reached the criterion and they're successful. And this is where those objectives come into play as well. So you need objectives to make sure that when you assess them, you know if they met criterion or not. Oh, sorry guys. Where was it? Sorry, I need to go for it. Okay, sorry, I need to go back. This is the last slide that I have for you guys, and this is also in your book, but I thought it just did a really good job of going through all of these essential components, and also applying them to a skill that you might have to break down. Remember, we've talked about how if you have a complex skill, you might have to break it down into its little components and teach those components. So you might have to have a task analysis. And so it
provides these, it gives you guys an example of how to use each component
of essential teaching with breaking a complex skill down to its components. So if you have a complex skill and you break it down into 3 components, you want to teach typically component 1 first. So you'll introduce the complex skill, connect it to the components, the student's life, introduce skill 1 as an important piece. You want to physically model it, explain key rules, engage students with questions, hands-on activities, things like that. Then you want them to rehearse it or practice. So provide opportunities for students to practice skill 1 with close guidance, feedback. Make sure that you give them easy examples to practice so you have high rates of success. And then you want to do independent practice. So provide reminders, then opportunities for independent practice with novel skill 1, examples from the real world, and things like that. And then you want to use novel examples of skill 1 to assess whether students can perform successfully without prompts. And if they can't do this, if there's a failure, you want to reteach. If they can do all this and they're successful, you go to component 2. So you'll review skill 1, introduce skill 2, connect it to a larger complex skill, restate the connection to their lives, physically model it, explain it, do your questions, your OTRs and things like that, hands-on activities, and then have them practice it and provide your feedback. Have them do, group or student guided practice, then independent practice, and then assess for mastery. And you can see how this kind of moves on and on. So, all right, guys. We talked about rationale for direct instruction. We also talked about CHAMPS, which is really cool. We talked about student-teacher relationships and then effective teaching, and there were those 5 components. So introducing the lesson, modeling it, selecting your examples, engaging students, talking when you're modeling it, and being very detailed, things like that. We talked about guided student practice, independent student practice, and then briefly on assessing skills so that you know when the skill has been mastered. So, all right, guys, that's it for this video. So thank you guys for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.